Okay, so in today's episode of Open Library Adventures to the Codebase, we're going to be talking about the availability button, which we see all over the place. It's this blue or gray or orange button, which is presenting the availability of a specific book on the platform. And we're going to quickly talk about the different parameters which enable it to show up and when each button is used. So if we use the inspect element, the first thing that we'll see is that there's a class called CTA button. CTA button is the base class for any one of these availability buttons. And then the CTA button may have two other components. One of them is whether it's readable or borrowable. Readable means that this is an unrestricted book. We believe it to be an unrestricted book, meaning either public domain or it can be read or downloaded, or depending on the permissibility of its license, repurposed in appropriate ways. And so that's read. And so if we were to click read, it would bring us right to the book with options to download, etc., from archive.org. And anytime we have a book that is readable, this other flag, CTA button available, will always be present. So availability or CTA button available is this the CSS directive which presents this as a blue button. So whether we have read or borrow, if the book is available, then this will present as blue. And we do have some Google Analytics that are based on this data OL link tracking. So CTA link, read or borrow, or listen, not available, etc. Okay, so the first type we've discussed is the read button, the read availability button. We also have borrow availability buttons. And if I were to inspect this element, the borrow availability button, then we see it still has a CTA button base class. It has CTA button available because this book is currently available to borrow. And then it has a CTA button borrow, which is saying that it is not readable. It has borrow restrictions. And so let's do two things. The first thing we can do is change this to read. And we see there's no actual decoration change of the button. However, if we change the available to add un at the beginning, so unavailable, we'll see that this becomes orange. And as a user or a patron using the website, they would identify this orange button as a book being checked out. And it should say checked out when that's the case. So now we've talked about two different types of buttons. The read button, which has CTA button available and CTA button read. And then the borrow button, which has either CTA button available or CTA button unavailable. And then also the CTA button borrow. Occasionally, we will see a book that is not in the library. And this kind of has two different cases to it. One of them might be CTA button missing, meaning this is actually a book that is not in the library. Or sometimes we might have a book that presents as not in the library for your average patron, but it actually does have a print disabled version that would show up different to an approved patron, which is a print disabled copy. And I think I mentioned earlier that the Library of Congress and other organizations will certify individuals who have print disabilities so that they can be approved for this program. And then once a central authority has kind of given the approval, print disabled patrons are able to access a class of books that may not otherwise be available to other patrons on the platform. However, there is an interesting side effect of books which are available in the print disabled format, which is it does give us the ability to present previews of this book to all patrons. So it's a limited preview that might include the table of contents, the front cover, the copyright page, some of the metadata. but is only fully accessible as a borrowable book to print disabled patrons. And even for print disabled patrons, the same technologies are used to protect the book, like the borrow period and using the special readers, etc. Um, okay, so far we've kind of discussed a ladder of at the bottom is not library. One step above is maybe the book is not in the library, but it is available to print disabled patrons and or it is available as a book preview. And then the next thing is that we have the book, but it is currently checked out. That means there are no copies available. And then above that, there's the borrow button, which has two cases we'll talk about. And then finally, it's the read button, which is the most permissive. It's public domain, or the platform has determined that there's a permissive license associated with it, which allows it to be freely read. Um, the borrow button has two different cases. One is some books have an extended borrow period where if you click on a book, then you can borrow it for 14 days. Um, that's in this case, it's 14 days. There might be other options as well in the future. There's also more of a browse version of borrow, which is a 1 hour borrow, in which you can renew it once you're done using it. But it's just a nice mechanism to make borrowing and accessing the book a little bit more equitable. And the reduced borrow period actually makes it more available to more people because we've seen data that shows many people only end up using the book for a short 1 hour period or so during research, and for people who need it longer, they can just renew the borrow. Anyway, that covers the different um, cases of the button. It's again, there's the not in library, the print disabled version, which looks just like not in library, but either enables book previews or it is a borrowable book to approved print disabled patrons. Then there are borrowable books that are unavailable, that are checked out. There are borrowable books that either have the 1 hour browse or the 2 week extended options. They present the same exact way through the user experience. And then we have the read button, which, other than the text, looks like the borrow button. And again, we showed that when a book becomes unavailable, so we can just write unavailable as a CSS property here. We can see that it turns orange. There is one other button which might show up, which is the donate button. This is a little bit more isolated of a case, but if we've determined that there's a book that is not in library and it's also not print disabled, we just don't have a copy at all. And we've determined that this is a book that the community has asked for or that the library needs in its collection, then sometimes we may, assuming all of the policy considerations allow for it, we may show a donate button that allows a patron to click and either make a decision to independently purchase the book or send us their copy so that it can be enjoyed by other library patrons using the same controlled digital lending restrictions that we apply for everything else in the library. Any questions so far about the availability button or the different ways that it can manifest?
No, no.
Okay, cool. So the next thing that we're going to do is, let's see if I can make this full screen. I'm going to SSH to one of our dev servers. Is this coming up visibly okay?
Yes.
All right. And then I'm going to go into my personal Dockerized setup here, and then just give you a little tour of how things are working behind the scenes. So the most important file regarding these borrow buttons. And I should also show that these buttons um, show up in other cases across the website. Is there anything special that you're noticing on this page, which might be a surprise to you?
Um, the search inside looks new to me, and I've never seen special access before.
Right. So what I'm going to do is copy our URL, and I'm going to go incognito, so I'm not logged in. And I'm going to press enter. And what are we seeing here?
Oh, special access is gone.
Right. So on the left side, as a user who either isn't logged in or is logged in as a normal patron, everyone will just see borrow. But if you happen to be a print disabled patron or an administrator such as myself who has to test out code for print disabled patrons, then we'll see a different button that says special access. And this is it's meant to reduce confusion. So if there is a patron who's been approved by a central authority as having a print disability, they will see a different type of text on their buttons. So you might see that um, on my version of the website, the text is slightly different, but that's not because this is true for everyone. It's just a special button that relates to print disabled patrons. Uh, but for now, I think we'll keep going with this example. So this button, the special access button or the borrow button or what we call the availability button, is controlled by a macro file which lives in Open Library, macros, and it's called loan status. And loan status has a whole bunch of logic that will pull from a variety of different sources that we're going to go through, because that's pretty central to how this code works. But something that we've done recently, which has been a really big step forward, is we've consolidated all of the logic for determining how this button shows up across any page on the website. And the reason that this is pretty important, I'm going to actually go to. I'm seeing if I have a non-administrator account that I can play with here for a second. So I'm going to go to Mech plus test 3. I'm going to log in, and here's Deadheads from books for June that I'm going to click borrow. And it brings me to Open Library, and we can see that we currently have a 1 hour borrow. By default, Open Library, everything is a 1 hour borrow, and you have the option to, on some books, you have the option to upgrade to a 14-day period. So we're on archive.org right now, which is the website where you actually read the material, and Open Library is the catalog. But I'm going to go back to Open Library here and click on the book that I just borrowed. And we're also going to see that I have two buttons here. I have a read button, which also has this listen component. And then we also have a return ebook. And if we were to do a search here, you can see that return ebook is actually a part of this loan status page. So pretty much anything that can show up in this component, that includes search inside, preview, return ebook, and read, is all managed by this loan status.html file. Want to read is an exception, I think. Want to read, yeah, I think the want to read is managed by a different component, which I would have to do a little bit more sleuthing to figure out exactly where that's coming from off the top of my head. But let's keep rolling with this. So the read, return, ebook, preview, and search inside are all coming from here. If I say search inside, we can see that's coming from the book search inside secondary action right here. And it's actually controllable whether we show search inside on a given page. On the reading log, for instance, we might not want to clutter the experience. So if I were to go to my reading log, You can see this only has a borrow button. It doesn't show search aside, and it also has a different action here. So we can customize what shows up here. Any questions so far?
No, no.
Okay. So one problem that we have been noticing is that on Open Library, sometimes a book will show up as not in library. I, maybe we can actually go back to the issue here. So this looks like it might be one of the relevant URLs. So this book appears to be available, right? It says read. I can even do a search inside. Let's type in test and see what happens, right? So the book is here, and it's even trying to come up with results, but it looks like Latin, so the word test is unlikely to show up. However, let me open up that link again. What are we noticing about the editions table? Anything about the consistency of the results?
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. So the button should say read, but it says not in library.
Right. So it seems like we have a few cases where this might be happening. So that's one, is why is this button showing up differently than this button? And we do have a tool to give us a little bit more information. What would you do if the Open Library page loaded and it had some sort of like Unicode error and it was showing you either an error page, or have you ever seen that yellow top bar that says like there's some sort of error?
Oh, sorry, keep on muting myself. Yes, the flash message. I've seen that before.
Um, when you do hit that flash message, is there a way to be able to get more information about the error?
I've not tried it. I know that you can append debug.
Yeah,
True.
awesome, awesome. So if we do debug equals true, I spent so much time trying to fix all of these buttons that I actually added some decorations that show you information about what it thinks it's loading. So here is lendable, false. Is print disabled, false. Is it readable? True, it is. So login is not required. Tells us information about the number of copies that may be available. And then there's something really, really cool here, which is it's kind of hidden. So I'm just going to paste it in the URL bar if you can see this. It says the source, the SRC, the source that is providing this data is a function called get ground truth availability. Whereas if we look at this button right here, what do we see about the source? Is it the same?
It's a different API.
It's a different API. So there are two, or there should be two APIs that are responsible for fetching availability information for Open Library. And that is going to be the next thing we look at, because this availability button in this file will actually pull from one or the other API, depending on what's available. So usually, let me explain why there happens to be a difference here. When we're on a book page, we need this value to be perfectly accurate, right? So we can't cache it. This has to be the status of the book right now. But if we have a book that has 100 editions, we can't call the super accurate, what we call the ground truth availability API every time for 100 or 1,000 different editions. And so we have two APIs. We have one called ground truth, which hits our lending system and gives kind of an authoritative um, response about the availability of a book. And then we have a bulk availability API. And I'll show you what both of those things look like. Uh, this is going to be kind of confusing because there's something connecting both of these APIs with this file. And I'm going to have to skip it for a second and go directly to these APIs. Does that kind of make sense? And is that okay?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay. So I'm going to open up a different file, which is the one which should define each of these underlying APIs, and then we'll connect the dots. What is the thing that takes this the loan status macro, which generates the availability button, and how does it get its data from the two APIs we're going to investigate? So first thing I'm going to do is instead of looking in macros, this would be very confusing for someone entering this code base for the first time. I just happen to know where everything lives. So I'm going to look in open library, core, lending. And lending is going to define two different functions. One of them is, can you predict what they might be called?
Probably get availability and was that get ground truth availability?
Exactly. So here we do have the ability to cache this value if we need. Um, but what ground truth availability does is it uses this S3 loan URL, um, and it attaches some parameters. And this API, I believe, is, let's see if we can open this up in a new S3, okay, right here. Right. And this %s is just archive.org. So I'm going to go to, makes sense. I'm just going to replace this with archive.org.
Mm-hmm.
And then what else does it have? It says we need an action, which is we want to check the availability. And then we also need an identifier. And this is the uh, ground truth API, the one we're seeing on the left here, which
Mm-hmm.
we predict is probably not broken, right?
Yes.
Okay. So far we already have an idea that maybe the website as a whole might have some issues with this core models lending get availability.
Mm-hmm.
So already we've been able to save a ton of time because of this instrumentation. This is also an aside. Sorry for wasting your time, but another thing that's interesting about this debugging is we can see it took 0.67 seconds. And at the very bottom, I actually compute this as a chart. So you can see every component because the question mark debug equals true. This will show you every component and how long it took. So it actually looks like nothing was too expensive. Maybe the work table. Oh, wait, data bar work? No, the additions table is fast. The data bar work is all of this stuff. So actually computing the ground truth was and the lists and all of that stuff looks like it took the most time, almost 0.8 seconds,
Mm-hmm.
40% of the time. So that's cool, but that's not our objective today. So what we're going to do here is get the ID of the book, which is right here. It's the OCA ID or the archive.org ID.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to go to archive.org/services/loan/loan question mark action equals availability. This trailing slash is important. And then we are going to add the ID and press enter. And here we get the authoritative ground truth response directly from archive.org's libraries lending availability API. And we see that this isn't a lendable book because what type of book is it?
Uh,
We should see in the first three items.
so I see it's readable.
Mhm.
So that means it's public domain or permissive license.
Yep, which means it's not a lendable book.
Mm-hmm.
Now you could kind of argue that this is a print disabled book, but the way that we kind of have this set up is that uh, if it's readable, then everyone can access it. If it's lendable, then it requires a borrow, and um, it doesn't matter if it's print disabled if it's lendable. Um, or that's only true. Sorry, that's not exactly true. It matters. These two are the ones that matter with each other. Um, so if it's not readable, then you'd want it to be either print disabled or lendable, right?
Mm.
Okay. Anyway, this is giving us authoritative data. And then I want to show you another API, which rather than me just having memorized it, I'm going to go back in the code. And what was the other API? Which one did we just look at?
So we looked at get ground truth availability, and the other one is get availability.
Right. Okay. So what do you think may be different intuitively, just based on how we're seeing it here? Is the difference between the get availability API and the get ground truth availability? Both maybe in terms of the accuracy and or in terms of how many books it works with.
Okay, so the get availability is for bulk, correct?
Yep.
I also see a status there. Is that status private?
So
I'm
let's
not sure
see
if
if
that's
we
on here.
also see. Um, yeah, so we are seeing a status here. That's very interesting. Um, that actually may be one of the errors that we're hitting. So let's keep that in our because what is this saying? This is saying is print disabled false is readable.
Uh,
So this is already giving us a ton of information. Um, so let's take a look next at what get availability,
yes.
and I'm going to see if you can intuit what this function is doing, especially because these docs are not stellar, huh? I think we
Uh,
should also fix that while we're going through this.
okay.
So this looks like an inner function, right?
Yes.
So we have some inner function. Uh, to me, when I see this, I have an intuition about what it's trying to accomplish. Do you have any guess, like in the most broad level of like, if you saw any program that did something like this, do you have any idea what it might be doing?
So it looks like it's adapting an old API to a new one.
That is like perfectly on point. So it's
Mm.
it's trying to normalize one API into an open library specific API. And when you look at Open Libraries page, why do you think we might be doing that?
Uh, hmm, I'm not sure.
Okay, awesome. That means I asked the right question. So the reason we're doing that is because how many different APIs are we using in the same way on this page?
Okay, so there's two different APIs in play.
Right. There's this get availability API, and there's also this get availability ground truth API.
Hmm.
And because we're calling two different services, which we'll see in a second, that have different keys, here we are updating the ground truth, or sorry, wrong order. We're updating the get availability API so that its keys and values conform with what we would expect for the ground truth API.
Okay, that makes sense.
But that also should maybe throw some red flags because if we're taking one API and trying to turn it into the other, it seems like there's more things that could go wrong. Um,
Yeah, there could be some missing fields or maybe different values for one API and not the other,
mhm.
this type of thing.
So ultimately, what's happening here is we're displaying a dictionary of values both for this reading log button, or not reading log, this availability button, which uses ground truth, and this availability button, which uses get availability, right? Both availability buttons store these dictionaries in the same field. And that's where we are going to connect um, the APIs with the the underlying loan status availability button. So what happens is when we're rendering our open library book page, right, or even a carousel, we have an addition or a work item that we get from the database, right, from Infobase or Infogami. So in this case, we would say, database, give us all of the data, like the authors, all the data that we need for this page for books OL 263215969M, right? And that happens in, we're going to be really verbose and jump around here, but that happens in Open Library, templates, type, edition, view, I think. Okay. And what happens is this whole record that we get from the database for books, whatever, gets passed into the template as page. So it's called page to be generic, but this is actually our book. And our book has everything that we would want on it. So if I do a search for availability, I need to figure out where that's happening. I think the page gets passed in. What we should look for is loan status, right? Where is loan status called? Loan status is called within the top here in data bar work. Remember when we scrolled all the way to the bottom here, it said data bar work was the thing that was taking a long time to load.
Yes.
And we said this left sidebar is what has data bar work. And if we scroll around, we can see work details, edition cover. Somewhere we're going to see the data bar work. Did you see it?
No, no.
Read options. That might just be the name of the macro and not the
like the class name
yeah.
or yeah.
So let's go in there. Let's go into that's a macro, right? So we're going to go to templates, or we're going to go to macros, data bar. What do we call it?
Lowercase d.
Data bar work. Thank you. You're paying attention more than I am. Sorry. So now, sorry, we're doing a deep dive here, but what's happening is we go to the page, right? And the first thing that Infogami and the whole open library system does is it fetches the edition under the hood and it passes this into the template as page. And then the page then gets sent in to data bar work right here. We pass in the edition or the work. And then we end up in this macro. And within the macro, availability, so here's where we say, here's where we actually generate the loan status button. And this is the loan status button. And what we're saying is pass in page. And what is page here?
That's the book, correct?
Yeah. So the loan status is going to get the book. And then there's a method here that says allow expensive availability check. We should probably rename this. Which one do you think is the expensive check?
So the accurate one, the ground truth one.
Exactly. So this should probably be renamed allow ground truth check. And then we pass in the, all the other parameters that we want. And so when we go back to our macro here, and then we look for allow expensive check, then let's see what happens. Let's try to look through the code here in our loan status availability button. So all of this is just documentation that tells us what these commands do. We're starting a timer so we know how long this whole file takes. And the first thing we do is say the availability of this book is this doc, which is going to be what? We just passed it in as page. This
Yeah,
is
it's the book.
the book. So here we're going to say the book we think has a field called availability. Something that is super special here is as soon as we call doc.availability, it'll try to fetch it if it doesn't have it.
Uh,
So here we're saying attempt to get the availability. If we have like an availability field, or uh-oh, there's no availability for this book information, which could be true. And then as we keep going, we say, all right, does it have an archive.org ID? Is this a work or is it an addition? Do we have a work key? Then there's some other stuff like, based on what we know about this book, is it my turn to borrow this book? Or do I already have it checked out? Stuff like that. But then here's the kicker. We say, if there is no availability on this book, and we're allowing it to do the expensive ground truth check,
mhm.
and we have an OCA ID, which is the archive.org ID, which you can't really do an expensive check if you don't actually have an ID for the book, right?
Mhm.
Then we're going to update our availability with the ground truth. So what can either happen is this whole thing kind of fails because there's no availability whatsoever. Or by default, what type of availability are we going to try to use?
By default, probably the bog one get availability.
That's right. And then if we're allowed to, we will fetch the expensive availability.
Mm.
Now, I think I remember that in the plugins upstream models, there's some availability method here. Okay. Maybe this is not really needed. There's one other place I want to check. In core models, no availability here. Okay, so I think we can just take it for granted that what happens here is, oh, I know exactly what's going on. And this is also going to be a part of the problem. So I know I'm kind of all over the place here, but one thing that I lied about is doc.availability does not fetch the availability in real time. So the doc.availability is going to fetch the availability off of the book if it's been injected into it.
Mm.
And when we perform an open library search, such as Lord of the Rings, what happens is we hit Solar. Solar gives us 50 results of the page back. We send those 50 results to archive.org. Archive.org lets us know what the availability is, and then we loop over these 50 and we add the availability dict.
Okay.
And we're going to see that now when we go back to the lending API. Where are we here? Lending API. So that's the get availability here. So get availability takes a key, which is the type of identifier, such as archive.org or open library work, and then IDs. And this will search for a list of books on archive.org's bulk availability API and return information, JSON information about their availability. Seem good?
Yes.
And so what that means is we're actually making, let's see if we could find the URL. So this is config IA availability API URL 2, which we're going to have to look in a bunch of secret files for. And I'd rather not do that on a call. So instead, I'm just going to go to what I know to be the URL. So this is the bulk availability, archive.org services loans loan question mark availability is with a trailing slash. And then what we're going to do is go to archive.org slash services slash availability. So this is kind of different. This is services loans loan with an action of availability. And this one is services availability. And we can see it has a similar format. It's a little bit more concise, has many of the same fields like available to borrow, available to borrow. What do you think available to browse means?
That it can be borrowed for an hour or
That's
looked at for an
exactly
hour.
right. That's exactly right. So this is letting us know whether a 1 hour or an extended a browse or an extended borrow is available, and these are available as data in both formats. Right. But the thing that's kind of unique here is, let me just jump into Lord of the Rings, and I'm gonna scroll down to the archive.org ID because I noticed that this book is borrowable. And I'm gonna throw it in here, identifier. We now have 2 identifiers and it's returning both. So there is, let me see if I can do a recap here. What happens is we load this page. The first thing that happens is we load the templates, right? The edition template, that's in templates, type, edition, view. And then this file calls the data bar work, which is this whole kind of left side. And so we open the macro data bar work. And the data bar work then sends in, it forwards the page, which is the book, to the loan status macro. And it says, hey, for this one, you shouldn't have any availability information because we haven't injected any. And so I want you to look up the expensive ground truth data. And this seems like it's working great, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, Now, so that's one way that this could happen. The other way is in the, there's 2 areas where the bulk, or there's 3 areas where the bulk API is used. The get availability API. Can you imagine where that might be true? You're looking
Um,
at one of them.
sure. So the addition table, the search, and maybe carousels.
Nailed it.
Okay.
Completely nailed it. Those are the 3 locations where what goes in is either a list of books that we have. In this case, these are coming from Solar, I think,
Mm.
the actual records. In search, they're coming from Solar. In our carousels, it's coming from a mix of like Infogami and archive.org. We're gonna skip that because I think we already know that we have an error in the availability API, the get availability, and not the ground truth. And I think we also know that it's not the loan status API that's broken. It's either the API call or the API itself, right?
Mm.
And we can probably check whether it's the API itself because we have the ground truth right here. And so we can compare what the bulk API is showing us and compare that with the ground truth. And already we're seeing a pretty big red flag, aren't we?
Yeah.
So Um, I still think it's worth. So we found our answer. There's something wrong with the availability API,
Hmm.
which is on the archive.org side of things, and it's probably not going to get solved by either of us.
Hmm.
Um, we might be able to work around this in Open Library. Maybe if we see a status that says private, we can still try to decorate it correctly if we learn more information about how this is going wrong.
Yeah.
But let's take a look at how the additions table is working, because I think that's pretty important. The additions table is working kind of in the same way as search. So we've gone through a lot. You're probably pretty overwhelmed, as I kind of am. But one area where I know we can look is what happens when I do a search for Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings hits plugins. Um, hits plugins, and then it goes into uh, work search, and then code.py. And so this is a whole mess of code that is like turning things into our Solr query. And after we do the Solr query, like what do we do with the records that we get back? There's a interesting piece of code here where we're actually passing a function in to our work search code called get availability of OCA IDs.
Hmm.
And here is the real magic. So it shows the same concept as I wanted to show you. So here we're getting the works by an author. So a good example is if we're on JR tokens page and it's getting all of the, oh my goodness, it's getting all of the works, right? So here we do a query based on the author key, and we add all of these other fields and facets that we need to consider. And at the end, what happens? We actually do the Solr query in our search engine, and it returns a list of works, and we extract them from Solr. And then finally, what we do is, I think, right here on the works, we call a function called get or add availability. And add availability takes these works, and for each one of the works, it attempts to look up this bulk API,
Hmm.
and then all of the bulk API information gets added to each work. What do you think the field is called?
Oh, on that maybe availability.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So each time we get a work back, uh, we we take all of these work IDs, and this is what's happening under the hood. So we have results with no availability buttons, right?
Hmm.
And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy um, this work ID, and then I'm going to try to get another one here, and then I'm going to copy this work ID. And is it okay if we just do it with two?
That's fine.
So imagine we have 50 of these, and instead of identifier, we're going to do open library work, and we'll give it two. And this is exactly what's these are getting folded in as the availability. So that's how these loan status buttons, each loan status button is getting rendered in the search results, and it's getting its respective piece of data. So this ground truth API is only used in two locations. One, it's for the book page when we need an authoritative answer, and when we're actually performing the borrow, we need to call this to invoke the borrow and to make sure that the data is right. And then the second case is the additions table or the search results or the carousel, which is taking a list of open library works or additions and then passing them to the bulk availability API. And then it's taking these results and folding them in with each item, each book, by injecting a key called availability. And so availability can either be from the get availability API or the get ground truth availability. And furthermore, if there's no availability, we can ask it to fetch it from the expensive one. Does that all make sense?
It does.
Okay, then the last thing we're going to look at is we mentioned that there's a, sorry, that's not what we want. We want the view for our edition page, this page. So we know it creates this data bar work, right? That's this. Data bar work uses what API?
The ground truth availability.
Yep. And so here we can see that right now we're in the view for the edition page,
Mhm.
templates type edition view. And we see it's calling the data bar work. And in data bar work, we ask it to use loan status with the expensive version, right?
Mhm.
But then we also have this additions list. And so we're gonna look for where on the page we have the additions list. Additions list. Can we just look for list? Additions list. So here it looks very similar, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Where we're doing some timing of the component, and then we're calling, in this case, it's not a macro, it's another template.
Mhm.
And instead of type edition view, which is where the file we're in right now, we're going to go into type work additions data table. And I bet if we search for availability, maybe we'll see this somewhere. It's curious because, oh, we're passing in the whole work, and then we get the additions. We're getting the sorted additions right here.
Mhm.
My money is on this get sorted additions may also add in the availability. So we can
Yeah.
check that. That's what we were looking at before for just a second. In plugins, open library, or plugins upstream models, we saw this thing called get sorted additions.
Mhm.
And here we use Solar to get all of the additions, right?
Okay. Yeah.
And then I bet if we keep looking, boom, what are we doing here? We are getting all of the
Mhm.
additions and we're sorting them. And then we are getting the availability of every single book. And then we're looping over every edition and we're setting the editions availability field to the bulk API, right?
Okay. Mhm.
And so that's where all of this is coming from. So now you're a pro. What you know is that there are 3 areas on the website that are using our loan status button, at least. There's the additions table, which uses bulk. There's the search, which fetches books through the Solar interface and then makes a call for Open Library works. It passes in all of the works, and then it folds these into the search results. And then there's the carousels, which works in much the same way. And then the other way that it happens is in the data bar work, we specifically ask for the ground truth API. And when we call the additions list, what happens is we ask Solar for all of the additions. So we actually do something different here. We're not using, this is the bulk API. We're not using Open Library work. Here we're actually using the identifier. It's the difference between checking at a work level and an addition level, right? Because on this page, these are all additions of the work that we want to look up. Whereas when we do search, it's all works. So we want to see if any addition is available for the work.
Okay, that makes sense. So identifier is for works
Close. The identifier
or
is for an
additions.
archive.org ID, which
Okay.
maps to an edition. But we could also use Open Library Edition here. So If we refresh, this is an edition page. It has
Mm.
books in M, otherwise it would say works. And we're going to pass this M thing here, Open Library Edition. Yeah, I guess it doesn't have uh, a record, uh, which is maybe a part of the problem.
Mm.
Ooh, wow. You know what the problem could be? That,
Maybe the data is out of sync.
yes,
Yeah.
we could use this admin feature here. Let me try this. Let's sync the archive.org ID on this.
Mm.
All right, we're synced. And now let's refresh this on Open Library. No dice. It did sync. But anyway, so we definitely still have an error, but and this doesn't work either. Okay. Anyway, this should work for identifier, which is the archive.org ID. And it could be more than one. Or it can be an open library work, OL dot 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 W. And this can also be a list. Whatever. Or it can be Open Library Edition. So those are really, it can be ISBN, it could be Open Library Edition, Open Library Work, or the identifier. And any of these can be a BC list. Okay. That concludes our Open Library tour, our adventure of the loan status API, which renders our buttons. And that at a very cursory level describes how we apply it for search results, carousels, and additions lists, and how the ground truth, which doesn't seem to have a problem, is used for our lending functionality and the main accurate button on Open Library. Do you feel exhausted and enlightened?
Yeah.